Hello, Jason. Nice to meet you. I'm glad to have the opportunity to hear you share about your life experiences and personal thoughts. Let's start by talking about your upbringing.
Sure, I came from mainland China, and my hometown is in Jiangsu.
How many siblings do you have, and where do you fall in the birth order?
I'm the oldest, and I have a younger sister.
Were you a studious child when you were young, or were you a playful kid?
I was more inclined towards being studious when I was young. My hometown was in a rural area. For a child from the countryside, it wasn't very common. Usually, rural children prefer to play. But I wasn't the type who particularly enjoyed playing.
How did you end up going abroad?
I came abroad to pursue a PhD degree.
What field of study did you pursue?
I studied mechanical engineering.
In those times, going abroad to study meant being an elite. You was an excellent student.
Regarding going abroad during that time, the US government had stricter regulations for Chinese students. It was more challenging. If you wanted to come to the United States for studies, you basically had to receive a full scholarship from a university. Only then could you come to study. If you couldn't secure a full scholarship, even if you received a partial scholarship, it was very difficult, challenging to receive funding.
So you came over on a full scholarship?
Yes, full scholarship.
How did you come across Falun Gong, and what led you to continue practicing it, and what circumstances kept you practicing it?
Well, that's a long story. It might take some time. During my postgraduate studies in Shanghai, I took an elective course on Qigong.
Ah, they still offered Qigong classes back then?
Yes, but actually, choosing Qigong was quite interesting. Initially, I didn't choose Qigong. I wasn't interested in other sports or activities. I didn't like basketball, football. I played table tennis, so I initially chose table tennis. But they said table tennis wasn't an option. It was reserved for competitive players, so after thinking about it, I didn't have any other activities to choose from. I thought Qigong would be relatively simple. I thought Qigong meant sitting still and doing nothing. I'm the type of person who doesn't like to move much, so I chose Qigong. Choosing Qigong at that time was also quite interesting to me. The teacher told us about many popular Qigong practices in the country at that time. He talked about their characteristics. I found it quite interesting. Of course, as a teacher, he didn't favor any specific school or practice. He only provided some basic introductions. But for me, it was an initial understanding of Qigong. Around 1996, my mother was diagnosed with advanced liver cancer. We went to the hospital, but surgery was no longer an option. After returning from the hospital, I thought about trying Qigong because I had some basic knowledge about it. Since the hospital couldn't help anymore, I wanted to see if Qigong could be of any help. So, I went to a park to find Qigong. Back in 1996, there were many Qigong practices in China, but when I went to the park, it was really strange. I looked around but couldn't find anyone practicing Qigong. I searched the entire park, which was the largest park in the city. But I didn't see anyone practicing Qigong, so I left the park. When I reached the park's entrance, right here at the entrance, there were a few people sitting. Actually, they were just sitting there. It didn't look like they were practicing. I approached and asked them, "What are you doing?" They said, "We are practicing Qigong." I said, "I came to find Qigong." There was a woman. I think she was around 40 or nearly 50 years old. I told her that my mother was sick, and I wanted to learn Qigong to teach her. She said, "Oh, then you've come to the right place. We practice Falun Gong." I thought, "Oh, my teacher told me about many Qigong practices, but I've never heard of Falun Gong." She said, "This one is really good." I was also practicing another Qigong at first, but later, I came here to practice. Because that day, the only Qigong I saw was them over there. So I said, okay then. My thought was I could learn it and then teach my mother. She started teaching me and gave me a book. At that time, I wasn't working in my hometown. When I returned to my hometown, I wanted to teach this method to my mother, but she couldn't accept it because we're from a rural area, rural people. She had never heard of these things. Also, she couldn't read. She didn't even know she had cancer, so I thought I shouldn't put too much pressure on her to learn because she didn't feel it was necessary. So my attempt to teach her Qigong was not successful, so I returned to my workplace, started preparing to go abroad.
Which year was that?
It was around the period from 1996 to 1999. I needed to prepare for English exams, TOEFL, GRE. The intensity was very high, so I put that matter aside. Then in 1999, I came to the United States. During my PhD studies in the United States, the learning intensity was also very high. If you have a full scholarship, you have to assist the professor in experiments. At the same time, the coursework in the US was quite demanding.
Wait a moment. I don't have the visuals here.
Where did we stop just now? We were talking about studying for a PhD. After coming to the United States, I completely forgot about practicing Qigong. I thought because Americans like to exercise, and as for me, as I mentioned earlier, I don't really enjoy playing sports and such activities, but I prefer things like running and practicing at home. So initially, I had some time, just treating it as a way to exercise. I practiced a bit, but later, because studying was intense, research was also demanding, I slowly let go of this matter. At that time, my wife came over. One day, my wife started experiencing certain symptoms. She couldn't sleep at night. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't explain the reason clearly, and occasionally, her body would have a sudden painful feeling, like nausea. And when you ask her about the pain, it disappears. She couldn't pinpoint where exactly it was. Anyway, it seemed like some part of her internal organs would spasm. It was very painful, and then, it would disappear after a while. She couldn't sleep. Basically, she couldn't sleep the whole night. I remember we also went to see a doctor. The doctor examined her, but found nothing wrong. He conducted some tests like blood pressure and blood sugar. So he said she seemed normal, that after she returned, she was still like that. If she couldn't sleep, I couldn't sleep either, because she was very uncomfortable. I took time off to stay with her at home. After that, both of us were very exhausted. We couldn't think of any solution, so I said, "Hey, I used to practice Qigong. Do you want to give it a try? I haven't practiced for a long time, and there's no music or anything. I only remember a few movements based on memory." So I showed her those gestures. We call it dynamic exercise. At that time, the movements weren't so accurate, but she practiced a few movements with me. We call it moving exercise. After practicing, she said, I was too tired. I couldn't move anymore. She just sat there on the sofa, half sitting, half lying. And I was thinking, she's at home, like this, and I've taken a leave anyway. I'll just stay home and accompany her. So I thought, what should I do? I'll just meditate. Actually, there's no music. And my meditation posture is not standard either, because Falun Gong requires double lotus position for meditation. At that time, I had difficulty even doing the single lotus position, and it was very imprecise. Anyway, I just wanted to sit there for a while. I sat on the floor and meditated, about 1 to 2 meters away from the sofa. When I was about to sit down, I noticed my wife was asleep on the sofa. She hadn't slept all night, and as soon as I started meditating, she fell asleep. So I thought, I'll just sit here. At that time, I sat for about 10 to 20 minutes, because when you start meditating, your legs are in pain. Even if it's not the double lotus position, it's still painful. So after sitting for about 10 minutes, I felt very uncomfortable, so I stopped. Then I thought, I need to be lighter, because she hadn't slept all night. So I let her rest. I was extremely quiet, no sound at all. When I took my leg down, she woke up. After she woke up, the first thing she said was, "Hey, I fell asleep just now." Suddenly, I felt something particularly amazing. because even though I didn't understand Qigong at that time, I knew that practicing exercises would have a certain effect. I initially learned it to teach my mom. Later, my mom didn't learn it, and I didn't think about practicing either. Later, I just wanted to do it like gymnastics. But I didn't expect that in this situation, when I was meditating, there was that kind of field, that kind of energy. You see, for her, sleeping was so difficult. And then suddenly, she could fall asleep just like that. We both found it extremely amazing. We started practicing from that time. That was in 2006.
That was a long time ago. At that time, overseas, probably not many people were practicing.
Occasionally, in some big cities in the United States, like Pittsburgh and other cities, we would see one or two, for example, when I went for a run in the morning.
Jason, I'd like to ask you about your upbringing. During your childhood, you've always received an atheist education, right? After encountering Falun Gong, were you able to accept the concept of gods and Buddhas mentioned in it?
Speaking of this matter, it's quite unique. From a young age, we were taught atheistic ideology in school, but because I grew up in the countryside, strangely enough, when I was young, I actually believed in gods, ghosts, and such things. One reason is that rural people tend to believe in these things more. When I was young, I often heard adults discussing these topics. One particular memory that stands out for me is about someone in our village. Their family had an elderly relative, a grandmother, but that grandmother, she was a bit mentally unstable. She seemed a little bit crazy, but she didn't do anything wrong. She just spoke to herself while walking alone. She wouldn't harm anyone or anything. At that time, children found it strange how this person could talk to herself, so they asked the elderly people. I remember it was my grandmother who told me that this person, initially, was perfectly normal. But one day, when she was returning home from her son's house, it was quite late. She passed by a cemetery, and she got lost in there. Then she sat down. She kept sitting until the next morning. On the next morning, someone passing by discovered her sitting on the ground, molding balls of clay in her hands, and talking to herself. After she went home, she continued to talk to herself. Rural people say that she was possessed by a ghost because she passed by the cemetery. She encountered a ghost. So, in terms of children, this kind of thing leaves a particularly deep impression because you actually saw such a person passing by you, and then the elderly person tells you what happened to her. So, for me, from a young age, these stories about gods and ghosts were actually very common when we were young, even though school taught us that there are no gods, no ghosts, because in real life, you encounter many things. So I have believed in God since I was young. I believe that gods exist. Now, what's interesting here is that after coming to the United States, many Christians came to evangelize. They were also my classmates. They urged me to join Christianity. So when they came, they first told me that the atheist ideology is wrong, and there is a God. I told them, I see that you're not older than me, and yet I have believed in God longer than you have. How is that possible? I told him that I have believed in God since I was young.
It's so interesting.
Yes.
After practicing Falun Gong, you just mentioned that because of her health, your wife's health was not good. So, did you experience any changes in your own health or thoughts? Were there any noticeable changes?
Well, for me, actually, from a relatively young age, probably from primary school to middle school, around the 4th or 5th grade of primary school, or when I just entered junior high school, sometimes I would have headaches. I would often drink a kind of syrup called Boozy Brain Tonic. I still remember the name because I drank it too much. When I came to the United States, some friends at the time recommended me to bring more medicine. The medicine I brought the most was painkillers because, in reality, there's not much you can do about headaches. When the pain becomes unbearable, you take painkillers. It was because I was pursuing PhD. You know, I thought it was due to excessive use of my brain. Later on, the frequency of the headaches increased. In the beginning, during junior high and high school, it would happen every 3 to 4 months or so. But later on, I remember that I would almost have it every week before practicing Falun Gong. Of course, I wasn't doing it for the sake of headaches, and I didn't connect these two things. But after I started practicing, at first, I didn't feel anything special, but then one day, I suddenly realized something. Hey, the frequency of my headaches has noticeably decreased. In a month, there might be only one occurrence, or maybe none for that month, and as time went on, the headaches became lighter and lighter. Moreover, even if I had a headache, it was different from before. Previously, the pain was so intense that you couldn't bear it. In the end, when there was no other way, you had to take painkillers, but later on, when I had a headache, it was already completely within manageable limits. It might be a little discomforting, occasionally having mild pain. It might be completely different. Afterward, when I had been practicing for about a year, I threw away all those painkillers.
So, did you ever feel unwell later on and need to go see a doctor? Should go or not go to the doctor to be an issue for you? How do you view this question of being ill?
That's how it is as for myself. I haven't been to the hospital anymore. Not only that, our children are already over 10 years old, and they have rarely. How should we understand this matter? For people who don't practice Falun Gong, they have a certain understanding of it. They say, Falun Gong doesn't allow medical treatment. It's not that Falun Gong doesn't allow medical treatment. If you really want to go to the hospital, you can go. No one is stopping you or saying that you can't go to the hospital. This is how I personally understand it. Regarding illnesses, let me give you an example. Let's say you have cancer. Did ancient China have this disease? Certainly, it did. But have you ever heard the ancients talk about cancer? No. They haven't. Cancer is a term given to you by genetics. That's a translation from the West. Even if you have this disease in traditional Chinese medicine, they don't call it cancer. What do they call it? They say that the affected area is experiencing a cold flow. What is the treatment method for it? He says, oh, let me give you an herbal medicine. What is the function of this herbal medicine? It softens hardness and disperses stagnation. This is the method in traditional Chinese medicine. There is also the possibility that they will use acupuncture on you, saying, oh, in this area of yours, the blood circulation is blocked. If you undergo acupuncture, you will definitely get better. This is another approach. Now, what about Qigong? Actually, I think it has its own explanation. Qigong also says that there is an illness in that area, due to the blockage of the meridians. If you practice diligently, you can unblock it. Western medicine has its own perspective and views on this illness. Traditional Chinese medicine has its own methods and perspectives, and Qigong has its own perspectives and methods. If you follow any of these paths, they can help you recover. Western medicine may also suggest surgery to remove that specific area. But in reality, for cancer, at least in the first 2 years, even if you undergo surgery, it may still spread. In fact, in my mother's case, it had already spread, so the hospital told us that surgery would be ineffective, or the medicine you take may not work. But on the other hand, when you go to the hospital, not everyone can be cured of cancer, right? The same goes for Qigong. It might be the case that some Qigong practices can be effective, but others may not necessarily work. So, you can't say that if you see one that doesn't work, you conclude that all Qigong practices don't work. In reality, it's because that specific practice, it may be related to the individual themselves. I think there are other factors, that is to say, when you practice Qigong and don't go to the hospital, and practice it well, if you can unblock that meridian, you won't get sick. In fact, it's true, including ourselves. After practicing Qigong, we haven't been to the hospital. Have we experienced any minor illnesses? Certainly. Like a slight headache, this discomfort is completely within control. There's no need to go to the hospital for it. It's this kind of situation.
So, I heard you say earlier that you attended a Qigong class in China. At that time, the Qigong class focused on Qigong theory. They also taught you the practice, right? The theory and the practical aspects were included. So, what is the difference between that and the Falun Gong practice you do now?
Well, the difference lies in the teacher, because it was the teacher who taught the theory. He talked about the various Qigong practices that were popular in China at that time. He also told you what those Qigong practices could achieve. He also taught us how to practice. Here's an interesting thing that happened. This incident deepened my understanding of Qigong. He once assigned homework and said, "When we finish today's class and go home, each of you, I will teach you a movement, and you practice it at home. Just 10 minutes before you go to sleep every night. Practice it for 10 minutes. And you might think, if I hold my hand up here for 10 minutes, how would you know if I did it or not?" At that time, the three of us happened to attend this Qigong class. We were three close friends, and we lived in the same dormitory. Among us, one person didn't practice at all. I followed the teacher's instructions and practiced for 10 minutes as he suggested. Then there was another person who occasionally practiced once or twice, and then stopped. They would practice once or twice a week. After about a couple of months, one day, we wanted to joke with the teacher. The three of us stood in front of the teacher and said, "Hey, teacher, look at us. Who among us three practiced and who didn't?" That teacher, he was quite old, around 80 years old, with a radiant face. He squinted his eyes and looked at the three of us. After a while, he said, "You practiced, you didn't practice, and you occasionally practiced." This was just the state of the three of us at that time. I found this incident very intriguing. Hey, all I did was hold my hand up for 10 minutes. How did he know that I practiced? He just glanced at me like that, and he didn't use anything. This incident deepened my understanding of Qigong. Oh, Qigong is truly amazing, even though it seems like just holding your hand in a certain way. Hey, whether you do it or not, your teacher can see it. Maybe not everyone can see it, but the teacher can truly see it. So, that was the Qigong at that time. Each form of Qigong has its own mechanism. When you practice, there is actually a mechanism of Qi flow. You can't practice one thing and another thing simultaneously. If you practice this and that at the same time, they will conflict with each other and end up fighting. That's actually harmful to your body. So, it's important to focus on one practice and avoid mixing different ones.
Later, you didn't choose to practice other exercises. You specifically chose Falun Gong. Was there something more special that attracted you to Falun Gong?
This topic, the question you asked, is quite interesting. In fact, someone has asked me the same question before. It was a university professor in China. We were sitting at a table, drinking alcohol. I mentioned that I don't drink alcohol. He asked me why I don't drink. I told him that I practice Falun Gong, so I don't drink. He said, "I just want to ask you one question. Why do you practice Falun Gong and not other exercises?" I thought for a moment, and I replied that this thing, actually, it's not like I had some special reason or intention. It's like listening to a radio. When you turn on the radio, suddenly you hear a station, and you feel that you really like that station, so you keep listening. There's no need for me that I have to select a different channel every day from 1 to 100 and decide if I want to listen to it or not, because I already like this one. And it's the same with practicing Qigong. I feel that this exercise is very good, so I continue to practice it. There's no need for me to look and see whether other exercises are better.
Going back to the previous topic, I want to ask this question. When you first came to the United States, there were missionaries who came to you to preach. Why didn't you join their religion?
This is also an interesting question. So they said, "Since you believe in God, why don't you come to the church?" I told them, "This matter is actually a bit special." I said, "In the depths of my heart, I always feel that there is a God who is actually watching over me. I don't know what kind of God this is, and I don't know how it works. But I feel like it's not the God of Christianity. It's not that God." They said, "Then why don't you give it a try? How do you know that you're not?" I told them, "I won't give it a try." I said, "When it comes to God, you can't say that you will try God, whether he is spiritual or not. That's disrespectful to God. Even though I believe that Christ is not the God I worship, I still have a certain respect for him. So many Christians have maintained a good relationship with me. They think I'm special because what they tell ordinary people doesn't seem to work with me. It's completely different with me. Something they haven't encountered.
It's very interesting.
Yes,
I have another question for you. Many Falun Gong practitioners say they have some extraordinary experiences while practicing. Have you had any of these experiences, like special abilities or celestial vision?
you mentioned special abilities and celestial vision. I've heard that some people have them, and I've even met people who have them, but I don't. Everyone is different, you see, and it's possible that as people like us, who have studied so much in mainstream society, these things can be obstacles. As for celestial vision, I haven't seen anything, but when you talk about special abilities, sometimes there are some miraculous things, but it's not like I can just will those abilities to manifest in myself.
Like many people who practice for healing and fitness, once they get better, they stop practicing. So, for you to persist continuously, it takes a lot of determination.
It's not quite how I understand it, including those around us. Of course, I know many people who practice. If you practice every day like that, and suddenly one day you stop practicing, you actually feel uncomfortable. Physically, if you don't practice for a week, you'll realize that your body, like a machine, gets stuck at certain joints. Of course, sometimes, for example, when I'm busy, or when something comes up, there may be a couple of days when I don't practice. That's also possible. But when I return to practice, I feel like my body seems to be rusting in place. When I practice again, and I feel like it opens up again, it's a particularly comfortable feeling.
I've heard many Falun Gong practitioners say that they need to constantly study and read books. That is necessary, right? Do you also need to read books every day?
As for books, we do read them every day. I have indeed read many books among ordinary people, but when it comes to books related to cultivation, they are different. They have profound meanings. It's not like you can look at it and say, oh, I understand it. It's not like reading a manual, like a Windows operating manual, where you flip through it and know how to use it. In reality, it has different levels and different meanings. So, do you keep reading books continuously? What are you constantly looking at then? You'll feel something new. In fact, you'll think, I've learned something new today.
What you've talked about today, I've gained a lot from it. Thank you, Dr. Jason Tao. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you very much.